Welcome back to the Code Wolf. In today's video, we're going to see how to add authenticated user login to an Azure app in about 10 minutes, though I've added some additional content beyond that time constraint for those who want to go deeper. This approach works for any framework or language and doesn't require any custom code unless you want to take things further. We'll see how to set this up first using Azure as a login provider, but then also see how to complete this same setup using external providers like Google or Facebook logins, and finally discuss some concepts for adding your own custom code features. This set of features is sometimes known as Easy Auth in Azure, and I think it's one of the most underappreciated or underutilized features of the platform in terms of security and authentication. This can be a real lifesaver if you just want to deploy an app out there and quickly get some user accounts set up with login, but it can also be expanded beyond that. So let's dive in and see how this works. A quick reminder to please hit subscribe to support the channel. The channel has really been growing lately, and it would be awesome to see that subscriber count keep going up. All right, just one quick diagram here to illustrate some concepts about how this is going to work. I think with authentication topics, people tend to get overwhelmed by details and then they sort of shut down. So we're just going to focus on some high-level flows and make sure we understand what's going on. So we have our app service out in Azure. So this is your app over here on the right. And so when a user request comes in, what we can do is enable some auth middleware in our app service environment. And if you're on Windows, this is IIS middleware. And if you're on Linux, that's going to run as an additional container in your environment. But either way, it creates this sort of middleware component that intercepts requests to our app and starts to manage some authentication for us. And this relies on something called federated identity. And that's where we essentially outsource our identity or login to a third party. And in some cases, that can just be Azure, but that can also be something like Google or GitHub or Apple, these other reputable sites out there that provide identities. And we're also going to see how to integrate with one of those providers. So the user gets launched out to one of those sites to log in, and then after they log in, they get sent back to our app. And optionally, they can include different claims for what their permissions or roles are, etc. But let's just focus on the basic flow right now and how to get this set up. All right, so to complete the steps ahead, you'll obviously need an app deployed to Azure. I'm not going to go over how to do that in this video. That's kind of a separate topic. But once you have the app deployed, that's all you need, and you can get started from there. And this can be any framework or language, whether that's Python or .NET or JavaScript. You just need an app running in App Service for this video. So I've deployed a simple server-side Blazor app called CodeWolf Easy Auth. Remember, this approach is sometimes called Easy Auth. And if we switch over to our other tab, it's just a simple out-of-the-box app. And right now, there's no authentication set up. So if I refresh this, you can see that there's no sign-in request or anything like that. So if we go back to Azure, let's say that we only want authenticated users to be able to access that homepage. Well, this is easy to do by going down to our settings and then to the authentication tab here. And it's going to ask us to add an identity provider. And remember, that's something like Microsoft with Azure, Facebook, Google, Twitter, etc. So let's click Add Identity Provider. Remember, this provider is what's going to manage your user logins. And from here, we can pick from a handful of them. And first, we're going to see how to do this just using Azure, since that's the simplest approach. And then we'll look at one of these third parties in a moment, which aren't all that much more complicated anyways. So I'm going to choose Microsoft, and then I'm going to choose the current tenant, which basically means that any user that's part of your Azure environment here with your Entra ID tenant will be able to log into this app. So what's nice about this approach with Azure is that it kind of sets up a lot of stuff for you. So it'll create a new app registration. And an app registration just associates your identity provider with an app. So this will just kind of link our app with our Azure tenant. And down here, we're just going to stick to a single tenant. We don't have to worry about all this multi-tenant stuff right now. Basically, this is just creating a link with our Microsoft Entra ID directory that will allow users to sign into our app using that. Now down here are some additional or more advanced settings that we don't really have to worry about. But you can limit which identities can log in and things like that. But I'm just going to leave these as is. And finally, these app service authentication settings. These are somewhat interesting. So for example, you can allow a mix where your site can be reached unauthenticated, but then you can still allow them to log in using the identity provider if you build some of that functionality yourself. But we're just going to make the whole site require authentication, so you'll be prompted to log in anytime you try to reach the site. At the end of the video, I'll include a section that goes into some of these concepts in a little more depth, such as user roles or unauthenticated parts of your website and so on. But for now, let's just keep going. And we're going to say all of our unauthenticated requests will be a 302 redirect. So this says recommended for websites, whereas a 401 would be recommended for APIs. But we have a website, so we'll be good to go. And we can leave the rest of these as is and just say add. And then it's going to add our identity provider. And so we'll see that pop in down at the bottom here. Now, if we click on this CodeWolf Easy Auth, that's going to take us over to our registered app here. And there's some additional settings that you can start to experiment with here, such as roles. We'll look at that a little bit more at the end of the video, but I just want to show you the basic flow here to get this all set up. So now if we were to go out to our website, what's really crazy is that this already now has login functionalities. So if I were to copy this URL out of Chrome here, and then let's switch over to Edge, and just make sure you're in a different browser window where you're not logged into any of your Microsoft accounts, and then paste in our website, and right away we'll get a prompt for our login. So this is going to ask us for a Microsoft login, and it already knows that I have an account here, so I'm just going to choose that, and then I'll enter in my password. And now when I click sign in, sure enough, there I'm redirected back to the homepage of the Blazor app. So there we go. Now you can also log out of here by going to the /auth/logout address here. Then it'll ask us which account to sign out of. So I'll sign out of there and it'll take a second. But after a moment, we're signed out and it'll recommend to close our windows. So after we log out here, I want to show you one other thing, and let's open up our browser tools so we can inspect what's going on here. I'm going to check preserve log and then switch to the document view so we can kind of step through this login and redirect workflow now that we've actually seen that in action. So if I were to just enter in our site, you can see that when we tried to reach that site on Azure, we got a 302, and that was redirected over to this login URL. So if we look at this in a little more detail here, we can see that this is actually a request to login.windows.net, and then that redirected us again to login.microsoftonline.com. So if the user tries to reach our site, they end up getting redirected to this login site for Azure. And then when we log in, so I'll go through that process again, and I'll click sign in. And you can see that there's some additional URLs here for some OAuth login stuff and a callback. And eventually we end up back in our site. So I just want to show that this is force redirecting us out to the Azure login. It's handling some OAuth concerns. So you can see there's this Federation OAuth 2. And then it ends up redirecting us back to our site. So that's really all you have to do to get the most basic login flow going. But now let's see how to set this up using a third-party provider. And just make sure that you log out again. Of course, you could add a link to that URL on your site, but just make sure that you're logged out. And then let's close out of our browser here. Okay, so it's great that we got login working with our app using Azure Identity, but what if we want our app to be more broadly accessible? Obviously, not all users are going to be in our Azure tenant. So what if we want users to be able to log in with Facebook or their Google account or their GitHub account? Well, we can easily accomplish that as well. And let's see how to do that now. So the first thing I'm going to do is just delete our Microsoft identity that we set up there. So now our app service no longer has an identity provider. And that'll create a warning up here that says traffic is still blocked because we have authentication enabled, but there's no identity provider essentially. So let's add this. And this will take us back to the original screen that we looked at. But now let's choose one of these third-party identity providers. And I'm actually going to choose GitHub because I like the flow that they set up. Some of these other options have requirements that make it more difficult to demo, such as requiring a top-level domain and things like that. But the GitHub flow is nice and simple. So after we choose GitHub, if we zoom in a little bit here, it's going to ask us for a client ID and a client secret. And if we mouse over this tooltips, it says a client ID is a unique identifier for an app registration, and a client secret is a secret value that the application uses to prove its identity when requesting a token. So in very simplified terms, you can think of this client secret as sort of a password And this client ID is sort of like a username just in the sense that it identifies our app to the identity provider. But long story short, we just need these two values to hook up to our identity provider, and then we'll be able to have login on our app. So don't worry if you don't understand all the intricacies of this flow. Just know that you need these two values to set this up. Now, if we click on this Learn More link, that will actually take us out to the docs here. And this provides some useful links out to each respective platform. So if you want the details of how to implement these, just go out to these different sites. It also tells us what the sign-in endpoints will have to be, which we'll look at in a moment. And we're going to use GitHub. So let's switch over to the GitHub site. And setting this up is actually really easy. So we just have to go over to our settings on our profile and then scroll down to developer settings. And on the left here, you can see we have this OAuth apps menu item. And right now I don't have any OAuth applications. So let's create a new one. So I'll say register and we'll call this CodeWolf Auth or whatever you'd like. And we do have to enter in our homepage URL. So remember, we can grab that off of our Azure site here and paste that in. And for the description, we'll just say the CodeWolf demo. And for the authorization callback URL, we can actually reference this same docs page to make sure that we wire this up right. So if we scroll down to these steps here, it's going to tell us that we have to use /auth/login and then our provider name, which in this case is GitHub. So if you're using Facebook, it would be Facebook and so on. But let's grab this URL segment here and let's paste that in here. And we also have to prefix our full domain onto that. So let's just make sure we get this set up and replace this with GitHub. And then let's register our application. And there it is. So it's really that easy. And now you'll notice we have our client ID and we have our client secrets, or rather we will in a moment when we say generate a new client secret. And it says make sure to copy our new client secret now since we won't be able to see this again. So let's grab that value and then let's switch back to our Azure portal. So that'll go in our secret. And then let's grab our client ID here and we'll paste that in for our ID there as well. And that's really all you have to do to set up this login for GitHub. Now, we still get these same settings for our app service behavior. So we want to require authentication everywhere across our site. So we'll leave that there. And we still want our 302 redirect, which is recommended for websites. So I'm going to click add, and then we'll get this notification that it successfully added GitHub as a provider. So let's see how this works now. So I'm going to grab our homepage URL again, and then let's switch out to an unauthenticated browser again. So I'll switch back to Edge here and paste in our site. And sure enough, we immediately get a GitHub login page. Remember, before we got the Microsoft Online login page because we had that set up as our provider. But now we've used a third-party provider using that client secret and our ID and setting this up as an app in GitHub. And now the user will be prompted to log in with their GitHub account. So I'll just log in here a second. And in my case, I was prompted for two-factor authentication. So just finish that process if you do get prompted. Now, because this is a third-party identity provider, we also have to click authorize, which just gives some really basic info about us to GitHub. And after we authorize that, it'll log us into our site. So now we're logged in using our GitHub identity. And that's really all there is to it. Whatever identity provider you choose will have similar steps to kind of set up an app on their site, give you that client ID and secret, and then you can go back into Azure and plug those in. Okay, so there's one more topic I want to discuss before we close things out, and that's just to give you a glimpse of how you would start to work with this setup programmatically if you wanted to start adding custom functionality or applying user roles and so on. Now, for this setup, I've reverted back to the Microsoft Identity setup rather than GitHub, just because it's easier to start working with roles and permissions and things like that. You can do those with the third-party providers, but you would have to use their custom endpoints or SDKs to add those types of permissions and roles. So let's just add a role to our user and see how we can access their claims and information or permissions in our app code. So on our authentication page on our app, let's click down into this identity provider link down here. And this will take us out to our registered apps. And let's go to app roles. So this is where we can define roles specifically for our app. And right now we don't have any roles added. So the first thing we want to do is create an app role. And I'm just going to call this admin, and we'll say that users and groups can be assigned to this. And you can see it says this specifies the value that will be included in the roles claim of a token identifying a user. So we can put whatever permissions we want in here. I'm just going to say task dot rule everything since they're an admin. And we'll just say full power for the description. And we want to enable this, of course, and let's click apply. So that will create a new app role. And then there's this link here that says, how do we actually assign these roles? So let's click on that. And it says that we have to jump over to our enterprise applications to do that. So let's go ahead and navigate over there. And from here, let's go to users and groups. So this is where we can start assigning those roles. And then I'm going to check this box next to my own name and say edit assignment. And you can see right now there's no roles assigned. So I'll choose this none selected. I think this is kind of an awkward UI screen, but I digress. So there's our admin role that we created. So let's choose that and click select. And then we'll say assign. And it'll say that that user was successfully assigned. So now when my user logs in and uses the site, it'll include some additional roles or claims with it that we could use in our code to start adding different functionality for users who have different levels of permissions or roles. So now let's see how to access those values over in our app. So for this part of the demo, I've redeployed our app and we now have this account page. And when I click on this, you can see it says your name is Alex Wolf. So it knows who's logged in and it tells me my name. So how did it know this? Let's see how we would access this in the code and print this out. Because remember, we haven't added any login code at all to our app. This is all just provided by Azure. So how can we actually access this? Well, if we go over to our app, let's zoom in a bit here. And I actually have this app attached to our app service instance that's deployed out there. So this is called remote debugging, where you can actually step through the code while it's running on Azure, which is a really cool feature that I'll cover in a different video. So after I set a break, let's go out to our account here and refresh this page. So we'll land on our breakpoint. And if we look at this code, there's two lines here. So the first, we're just getting the request. So we're injecting the HTTP context accessor into our Blazor page. As a side note, be careful how you approach this with different Blazor models. Accessing HTTP context can be pretty nuanced with Blazor, but for demo purposes, this is fine. So we have this request object, and if we mouse over this, let's navigate down into the headers object here. And this might be really difficult to see, but I'll fix that in a minute here. And so if we go down to our headers and then click on this raw view, we just want to look at what information is coming through in our app that we can use to view the user roles and the user permissions and all that. So under this extras property, Azure will actually add in a header here that's called XMS Client Principal. And so that's this one right here. There's some other ones that it adds here as well, but we're mostly interested in this value. So let's expand that value. And if I were to click view, you can see we actually get this pop-up that includes this base 64 encoded information about our user. So let's copy this, and then we can go out to some sort of base 64 decoding site like this and just decode the value here. And that'll create some nice JSON for us that includes all of our information. And so I've just pasted that JSON into a parser here and kind of cleaned up our view on the right. So what you can see is that this includes 19 different claims about the user, but most of them we don't care about. They're just sort of informational. But you can see that two of these include the name of the user as well as that role that we created. So here's that value we entered into Azure for this role, which was task.rule everything. So you could create different roles with different permissions that translate into claims that you can use in your app. This also includes the email address and some other useful information, so you can just look through here as needed. Now, if we switch back to our app, I do want to mention that we have this other line of code here, and that's where I'm actually parsing this request so that we can display the username up here. And this code is basically just some JSON parsing code. I'll include a link to where I got this sample code in the description down below. But regardless of whatever language you're using, you should be able to just parse out these headers and get the information and claims that you need to start building in some custom functionality. One final side note I want to mention when you're architecting apps around this authentication setup. If you remember when we first configured our identity provider, It asked us if we want to allow unauthenticated access. Now, there's kind of two approaches you could take here if you want part of your site to be anonymous so anyone can access it, and part of it to be authenticated. One option is to use this allow unauthenticated access, but then this will require custom development. So you'd have to access the user's claims in the code, like we just looked at, and determine whether they're allowed to access certain parts of the site. So obviously that will require some more custom development. The other option would be to have some sort of static landing page. So for example, you could host a basic marketing page in something like Azure Static Websites, which is low cost, in some cases free. And that way you could have sort of that promotional public facing content just in a simple site, always public. And then the real part of your app that users need to be authenticated for, that's when you could enable this and just make sure that site always requires authentication all the time. And then you wouldn't have to do any custom development. So just kind of a side note there. If there's a lot of interest in this video, I can create more content around building out functionality with users and roles and custom development with this. But hopefully this will get you started. So thanks so much for watching. Please hit that like or subscribe button, and I'll see you next time.